Hello, everybody. My name is David Bryson. Thank you for joining with me today. I've got some really great things to share with you today. We're going to learn about the Cathars. The Cathars were these awesome spiritual people who really lived life and lived love as a practice. And their story is amazing. They were a Christian sect that broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 10th century, and they were preceded by many variations of Christian Gnosticism. But they flourished in southern France in the Languedoc region and brought so much great culture to humanity. The troubadour movement emerged from the Cathars, and they were regarded by all of the neighbors as the bonhommes, or the good men, or the good people, because of just the level of kindness and charity and love and positivity. These were people who were really putting into practice the teachings of Christ outside of the constraints, limitations, and strictures of the institutional Christian church, which at the time in that region was the Roman Catholic Church. There was such power in this movement that the monasteries and nunneries began to convert to Catharism, and this sect, this movement, became such a threat to the powers that be, which again at that time was the Pope and the Vatican, that they actually instituted the Great Inquisition to deal with the Cathar heresy. In fact, historically it's referred to as the Great Heresy, not just one heresy among many heresies, but the great one, because it literally threatened the entire power base of the Roman Catholic Church. And the story of the Cathars is absolutely amazing. I'm looking really forward to sharing this video series with you. I will be reading directly from this book by Graham Hancock, the first section of which is probably one of the best synopses of the Cathar movement that I've been able to find. When I discovered the Cathars 2 years ago in February of 2013, it really changed my life and made me realize how in so many ways I could personally identify with the teachings of the Cathars. And they were persecuted and put to death. And one of the last remaining Cathars gave a prophecy that said that the branch of the laurel will turn green in 700 years. And he was burned at the stake in the early 1300s, and it's approximately 700 years, and the greening of the laurel is happening. There's many people who are resonating with the teachings of the Cathars, and we hope that as you hear their amazing story, that maybe you will hear deep in your soul the call to return to your own Cathar roots in spirit. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and do a screen share. And I've downloaded for Kindle the master game, and we will be reading directly from this book. Mixed with the many other currents and forces that are acknowledged to have driven the French Revolution, we've tried to demonstrate in Chapter 1 that powerful religious and spiritual energies were also at play. These energies surfaced visibly in an aggressive de-Christianization campaign that saw great cathedrals, including the famous Notre Dame in Paris, reconsecrated as temples of the Supreme Being. Throughout the land, ancient Egypt and other pagan images were substituted for Christian symbols, notably the cross, and even ancient Egyptian deities such as the goddess Isis were venerated. The convention was thus not referring to the God of the Christians or to the Christian vision of the afterlife, when it affirmed in 1794 that the people of France recognized the existence of the Supreme Being and the immortality of the soul. Strange and startling though these developments were, the late 18th century was not the first time that a religion utterly opposed to Christianity, showing signs of an ancient Egyptian influence and deeply interested in the fate of the soul, had taken root in the land we now know as France. In the 12th century, more than 600 years before the Revolution, just such an alternative religion had materialized in Provence and Languedoc, seemingly out of nowhere. already deeply entrenched in the hearts and minds of large sectors of the population. It was also present in force in adjoining districts of eastern Spain and northern Italy, and scattered in smaller communities throughout the rest of Europe, as far afield as Belgium, northern France, and Germany. The name of this region that had so rapidly and successfully displaced the Roman Catholic Church in areas so close to the seat of its own power was Christianity. At any rate, its practitioners called themselves good Christians, but the Church labeled them heretics from the moment they first came to its attention. Their contemporaries are the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries frequently called them Manichees, after the ancient dualistic heresy of Manichaeism, supposedly wiped out in Europe hundreds of years previously. And they were also known by a wide variety of other epithets, including most commonly Albigensians, after Albi, a prominent city of Languedoc, and Cathars, derived from the Greek word katharos, and meaning the pure. These Cathars, the name we will generally use here, venerated Jesus Christ every bit as much as the Catholics did. That was why they called themselves good Christians. But the place that he occupied in their religion was radically different. In the Catholic view, Christ was the Word made flesh who dwelt among us. The Cathars repudiated this utterly and worshipped him as a being of pure spirit, an emanation from the good God, a projection or an apparition. They categorically denied his material incarnation as the Son of God, born in a human body to dwell among us. They also forcefully rejected the Catholic teaching of Christ crucified for sins. How could he have been crucified, they asked, if he had never existed physically in the first place? Far from revering the central spiritual symbol of Christianity, therefore, the Cathars denied the significance of the cross. For them, it was an obscene instrument of torture that the Church of Rome had misled millions into worshiping as an idol. Turning the most cherished symbols, doctrines, and dogmas of Christianity upside down like this was a Cathar specialty that infuriated and repeatedly challenged the medieval Catholic Church. The source of the problem was that unlike the single, all-powerful, and all-good God of the Christians, the Cathars were dualists who believed in the parallel existence of two deities, a God of good and a God of evil. Each was powerful only in his own domain and nearly impotent in the realm of the other. The domain of the God of good was entirely spiritual, intangible, immaterial, and filled with light. It was here that human souls had originated, the creation of the good God. The domain of the God of evil was the earth itself, the material world and all physical life upon it, an infernal place of pain and punishment filled with darkness and iniquity. In the Cathar scheme of things, it was the God of evil, the maker and ruler of the material world, who had fashioned the bodies, though not the souls, of mankind out of what they called mud and water. And it was towards the same evil God, Cathar preachers argued, that the worship of the Roman Catholic Church was directed. The Pope, in other words, was not a servant of the good God, but the devil's representative on earth. And the purpose of the Catholic Church was not to transmit our souls to the spiritual and light-filled domain of heaven after death, but to trick us into returning again and again in one human incarnation after another to the hell realm of the material world. Only a lifetime of self-denial, culminating in a special gnosis or inspired knowledge, attained on initiation into the highest grade of the Cathar faith, could save us. It was a revolutionary teaching and, in 12th century, an extremely dangerous one. Hesitating at the crossroads. During the period of world history for which written records have survived, most of the last 5,000 years, no scholar would seriously argue the proposition that religions have played a fundamental role in shaping the character of civilization and directing its course. Likewise, few would dispute that the human race during this period has consistently been divided not only by different languages and cultures, but also by the competing spheres of influence of different religions. Some ancient faiths that once commanded absolute obedience across vast areas have withered away and vanished. Others that were insignificant have risen to prominence. Others still were almost forgotten in their original homelands, but have flourished in distant lands. Against the recent background of rampant secularism in many rich countries and rampant religious fervor in many poor ones, we are left today with four great faiths commanding distinct socio-geographic spheres of influence that still collectively claim the allegiance of roughly 9 of every 10 of us. Hinduism is strong only in the Indian subcontinent, but there it has over 800 million adherents. Buddhism sprawls from Sri Lanka to Tibet, from China to Southeast Asia and Japan. Islam has hundreds of millions of followers in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, the Levant, and North Africa, but its heartland and historical home is in the Arabian Peninsula. Christianity has a near monopoly in the Americas, having obliterated or utterly marginalized all the New World's indigenous faiths during the past 500 years. It also predominates in Australia, New Zealand, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other areas of former European colonial expansion. Its historical home is in the Eastern Mediterranean. However, after the triumph of Islam in the Middle East and North Africa more than 1,000 years ago, Christianity's heartland moved to Europe itself. Today, as a result, it is a habit of mine to think of Europe as a region locked so firmly and for so long within the Christian sphere of influence that no other faith need be considered to have shaped its destiny. For scholars prepared to look hard enough, there are, of course, faint traces of earlier pagan beliefs in the European heritage, but these are rarities and throwbacks, quaint exotica with no mainstream impact. Whether we travel to Austria, Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Greece, Holland, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, or Switzerland, the reality is that all the countries of Europe confront us with very long, unbroken traditions of Christianity. In some cases, these traditions substantially predate the 4th century AD, when the Roman Empire under Constantine adopted Christianity as its state religion and established Rome, where a persecuted Christian community had already existed for 250 years, as the headquarters of the newly empowered Catholic Church. Almost immediately after coming into imperial favor, the formerly persecuted church fathers themselves turned persecutors. They sought to impose their control on Christians throughout the Roman Empire, to suppress schisms, and to distill a universally agreed doctrine out of the great variety of teachings that the faith had previously encompassed. To this end, as we will see later in later chapters, they promulgated dogmas and defined and declared anathemas upon a whole series of heresies. These were systematically hunted down, and these were then systematically hunted down and obliterated over the next 3 centuries. Notable among the forbidden faiths was the great dualist heresy of Manichaeism, to which no less a figure than St. Augustine, one of the foremost revered doctors of the church, had belonged for 9 years before converting to Christianity in AD 386. Claiming to lead to direct and personal knowledge of the divine, all forms of Gnosticism were also persecuted to vanishing point. Influenced by elements of the ancient Egyptian religion, Asian and Middle Eastern mysticism, Greek philosophy, and alternative interpretations of Jewish and Christian teachings, Gnosticism was as profoundly dualistic as Manichaeism, and was for some centuries the chief rival to Roman Catholic hegemony. By the 7th century, however, Manichaeism had been expelled to the distant east, and the numerous Gnostic sects that had confronted the early church seemed to have been obliterated. No longer facing any organized spiritual competition, Catholicism was able to see out the remainder of the Western Dark Ages with its defenses relaxed. The result, by the early 11th century, was that churchmen had no living experience of heresy. Those who sought to remind themselves of its dangers could only turn to books, amongst them St. Augustine's agonized account of his own, quote, errors as a Manichae, written 700 years earlier. It therefore came as something of a jolt when a heresy looking very much like Manichaeism suddenly resurfaced in the 12th century in the form of Catharism in areas at the very heart of Western culture. Moreover, it proved to be no transitory movement linked to the lives of a few charismatic leaders, but the most deadly threat ever to confront the Catholic faith. Appearing as though from nowhere, it was a well-organized anti-church that claimed an antiquity even greater than that of Catholicism itself. It also had the temerity to recruit its new members directly from Catholic ranks. What made Catharism such a threat and outrage to the Catholic Church, however, was not just its embarrassing success at converting Catholics, nor the challenge of its doctrines, radical though they were. Nor was it simply the shock of confronting a dualist heresy that seemed to have conjured itself up out of the past like a ghost. Nor was it the heresy's obvious dynamism, nor the uncomfortably rapid spread of its sphere of influence ever closer to Rome during the 12th century. The real problem was that, as well as winning over large numbers of ordinary people, Catharism had succeeded in attracting the tacit and sometimes even the overt support of some of the most powerful noble families in southwestern Europe. These included, most notably, the Counts of Toulouse, the Counts of Foix, the Trencaval Viscounts, who ruled the walled cities of Albi, Béziers, and Carcassonne, with their knights and castles and strength of arms concentrated in the Languedoc and surrounding areas. Such men had transformed Catharism into something that the Church of Rome had never faced before. Here was a heresy that could fight back, that would not easily be crushed by the use of secular force, and that might conceivably, if allowed to grow further, push the Catholic religion out of Europe altogether. For more than a century, with consequences that reach us today, European civilization hesitated at the crossroads of two competing spiritual systems and confronted the choice of two very different ways forward into the future. Let's take a closer look at the key players and events during this decisive period of history. A language in which "ac" means yes. Languedoc today is part of the colorful mosaic of southern France. It adjoins Provence to the east, and it is separated from Spain to the west by the Pyrenees Mountains. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it was famed for the romantic poetry of its troubadours, for its courts of love, for the fiercely dependent character of its people, and for its unique culture. Underlying the sense of difference was the basic fact that the people of Provence and Languedoc had never been French subjects and did not even speak French. Indeed, at that time, what the word France conjured to mind for most was just the Île-de-France, the region immediately around Paris. Most broadly defined, France also included the territories lying between the Loire, the middle part of the Meuse, and the Scheldt. But the lands to the south of the Loire and south of the Massif Central, as well as the whole of the Mediterranean coast, were excluded. As late as the 14th century, travelers heading north from Toulouse or Avignon thought of themselves as journeying to France rather than within it. Together with the regions of Limousin and Old Aquitaine and the southern part of the French Alps, Languedoc and Provence were known in medieval times by the collective name of Occitania. They by no means formed a state or a country, as we understand those concepts today. On the contrary, other than to friends, family, and neighbors, the primary loyalties of the majority of the inhabitants were to this town or city in which they lived, or to the aristocrats whose fields they plowed. Still, they had much more in common with each other than they did with the cultural and political community of northern states that were in the process of becoming France. And above all else, these Occitanians were united by their common language, literally the Languedoc, that is to say the language in which the word for yes is "ac," as opposed to Languedoc, the 12th century language that was to evolve into modern French, in which the word for yes was oil, later to become the more familiar oui of today. Medieval scholar Joseph Strayer points out that the French of the north and the Occitan of the south are separated by one of the sharpest breaks in the whole family of Romance languages and are mutually incomprehensible. Occitan is, however, very close to Catalan and quite close to Castilian. The result is that in the 12th century, a merchant from Narbonne would have been easily understood in Barcelona, while he would have needed an interpreter in Paris. A baron of the Ile-de-France would have found more men to talk to in London, or even in Cologne, than he would have in Toulouse. Now, a language barrier is not an impassable obstacle, but it is a real one, and it is the kind of barrier that creates misunderstandings and suspicion. The mailed fist of Occitania. Power in Occitania was in the hands of a feudal aristocracy dominated by the three great families of Foix, Trinqueval, and Toulouse. Described at the time as the peers of kings, the superiors of dukes and counts, the princes of the house of Toulouse ruled a domain extending from Toulouse itself to Nimes in the east and from Cahors in the north to Narbonne on the Mediterranean coast. They also enjoyed, and could sometimes call upon, an impressive range of international alliances. Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, from 1194 to 1222, for example, was a cousin of the King of France and brother-in-law to the kings both of England and of Aragon. He also tolerated and sometimes even promoted Catharism and traveled with the Cathar holy man. The Counts of Foix, lords of the High Pyrenees along the border with Spain, were renowned for their military prowess, stubborn ruthlessness, and strong Cathar connections. In 1204, Raymond Roger, Count of Foix from 1188 till 1223, witnessed the reception of his widowed sister Esclarmonde into the perfecti, literally the perfect, the highest rank of Cathar initiates. 2 years later, his own wife, having borne him 6 children, was also received into the perfecti and retired from the world to preside over the Cathar equivalent of a nunnery. Though never avowedly a Cathar himself, Raymond Roger was staunchly anti-Catholic all his life. On one occasion, it seems that soldiers in his employ chopped a cannon of the church into pieces and used the arms and legs of a crucifix to grind up spices with in lieu of a pestle. In a lengthy essay on the barbarity and malignity of the Count of Foix, a contemporary pro-Catholic chronicler wrote, "His wickedness exceeded all bounds. He pillaged monasteries, destroyed churches, excelled all others in cruelty." The Trinqueval dynasty, controlling lands that stretched from the Tarn to the Pyrenees, added their own combination of wealth, hereditary influence, military might, and pro-Cathar sympathies to the equation of power in Languedoc. Raymond Roger Trinqueval, who ruled from 1194 until his capture and murder by Catholics in 1209, had been tutored by the well-known Cathar scholar Bertrand de Saussure. The latter had once shown his contempt for the laws of Catholicism when a monk he disliked was elected abbot at the monastery of Sainte Marie of Alais. Bertrand's response was to have the corpse of the former abbot exhumed and placed, moldering, in the abbatial chair to supervise a new election. Not surprisingly, the abbot elected on this occasion did meet with Bertrand's favor. Support for and involvement with the Cathars, combined with a rejection of the church, were not confined solely to the upper levels of the aristocracy. In the Lauragais, the populous area between Toulouse and Carcassonne, the minor nobility are reported to have been almost solidly Cathar. The same was also the case for their counterparts in the Corbière between Carcassonne and Narbonne. Tellingly, it has been calculated that 30% of all Cathar perfecti were of noble birth. Moreover, even the remaining Catholic nobility of Occitania were often proved to be at least sympathetic to the Cathars, and at times were openly supportive of them. An indication of their dilemma is to be seen in the reply given by the Catholic knight Pons de Adamar of Rodel when he was asked by Fawkes, the bishop of Toulouse, why he and his co-religionists had not expelled the heretics from their lands. In reply, "We cannot. We have grown up among them. We have relatives among them, and we see them living good, decent lives of perfection." Weaving the threads of the great heresy. Thus sheltered by the aristocracy of the region on both sides of the religious divide, the Cathars also found strong support at all other levels of Alcitanian society. Large numbers of them were skilled craftsmen and artisans. A list of Cathars present in the city of Béziers in 1209 includes 1 noble, a baroness, 4 doctors, 5 hosiers, 2 blacksmiths, 2 pelterers, 2 shoemakers, a sheep shearer, a carpenter, a weaver, a saddler, a corn dealer, a cutler, a tailor, a tavern keeper, a baker, a wool worker, a mercer, and a money changer. Martin Barber, professor of history at the University of Reading, observes that the Béziers list includes no less than 10 individuals employed in the textile industry, and that a great many other primary documents from the period likewise link weavers or textorius to the heresy. This is true both within and outside the borders of Occitania. In France, the general name by which Cathars were known was simply texerons, the weavers. In 1145, the renowned French ecclesiastic Bernard of Clairvaux undertook a preaching tour to warn against a heresy of weavers. It had supposedly sprung up fully formed from the suggestions and artifices of seducing spirits, and was so successful at winning conversions that, quote, "women have quitted their husbands, men have deserted their wives. Clerks and priests often abandon their flocks and their churches, and are found in the throng among weavers, male and female." Likewise, in 1157, Archbishop Samson of Reims was almost certainly complaining of Cathar missionary activity when he spoke of a Manichaean plague that had recently infected the greater part of Flanders. We noted earlier that 12th century churchmen commonly referred to the Cathars as Manichaeans, after the dualistic sect of that name that had supposedly been stamped out hundreds of years previously. This new outbreak of heresy, Samson said, was being spread by itinerant weavers and cloth merchants. The explanation is simple. Employment as weavers and in other sectors of the medieval cloth trade, with its extensive international connections, was chosen as cover by Cathar perfecti. They needed cover to avoid early detection by church authorities because they were mounting what can only be described as a large-scale and well-thought-out missionary campaign. The rather gentle, patient, and systematic methods that they used to win local trust and eventually the conversions to the heresy have been nicely described by the Canadian historian Stephen O'Shea, quote, "On the paths and rivers of the Languedoc of 1150, there were not only traders and troubadours, but also pairs of itinerant holy men, recognizable by the thin leather thong tied around the waist of their black robes. They entered villages and towns, set up shop, often as weavers, and became known for their honest, hard work. When the time came, they would talk, first in the moonlight, beyond the walls, then out in the open, before the fireplaces of noble and burgher, in the houses of tradespeople, near the stalls of the marketplace. They asked for nothing, no alms, no obeisance, just a hearing. Within a generation, these Cathar missionaries had converted thousands. Languedoc had become host to what would be called the Great Heresy." The Perfecti and the Credentes. The missionaries were all Cathar Perfecti, and as Stephen O'Shea rightly observes, it was their custom, like modern Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, to travel and evangelize in pairs. Their black robes would have given them something of the look of Christian monks or priests. Other than their appearance, however, there was really no similarity at all between the lifestyles of these perfecti and the lifestyles of the typical Catholic clergy of that period. As even their most bitter opponents were willing to admit, The distinguishing characteristic of the perfectus was that they lived exemplary lives of chastity, humility, great poverty, and simplicity throughout the whole period of Catharism's rise and fall. Meanwhile, the church of the 11th and 12th centuries had already become decadent and disreputable. It was widely despised because of the rampant sexual license of so many of its ministers. In some areas, it was openly hated because of its vast wealth, corruption, greed, and unnecessary ostentation. Doubling as large-scale feudal landlords, most bishops enjoyed lives of profligate, scandalous luxury. No wonder, then, that they were unpopular in their own dioceses, where they were reviled for their indifference to the privations of the poor. To understand the extreme asceticism for which the perfecti were renowned, one need only recall the teaching that lay at the core of Cathar dualism. The material world was the wholly evil creation of a wholly evil God. All contact with matter was therefore also evil and could only inhibit Catharism's primary project. This was the gradual purification and eventual release of immortal human souls from their cycle of rebirths in mortal human bodies. O Lord, judge and condemn the imperfections of the flesh, went one of their prayers. Have no pity on the flesh born of corruption, but show mercy to the spirit which is imprisoned. The perfecti were active participants in what they saw as a cosmic struggle between utterly incompatible powers, spirit and matter, good and evil. Success in the struggle required them to lead lives in strict accordance with their beliefs and teachings. Since flesh was born of corruption, it followed that any foodstuff thought to have originated from processes of coition and reproduction were absolutely forbidden to them. This meant, in practice, that they could eat neither flesh nor fowl, nor any of the derivatives from these creatures, such as eggs, milk, cheese, cream, or lard. Their diet consisted of bread, vegetables, pulses, fruits, and nuts. Inconsistently to the modern mind, fish were also allowed. This was because of a medieval misconception that fish did not issue from sexual reproduction, but were somehow spontaneously generated in water or mud. The same anti-reproductive, anti-coital logic meant, of course, that the perfecti must themselves be totally celibate. Even an unchaste kiss was believed sufficient to destroy their ritual purity. All other bodily needs and desires brought the same peril and were likewise to be shunned. To harden their resistance to the desire for nourishment, they not only rigorously followed the already sparse diet outlined above, but also subjected themselves to lengthy fasts amounting to more than 70 days a year on bread and water alone. The purpose of all these privations was to loosen the bonds that imprisoned the soul within the body. In pursuit of the same objective, and in order further to minimize their contacts with the snares and lures of the material world, the perfecti renounced all property and personal possessions except the clothes that they stood up in. Many other austerities were also required of them. Despite these, however, there was no shortage of candidates for the perfectus grade, and the Cathar religion, in fact, made it very difficult for anyone to achieve it. Aspiring perfecti underwent a period of training and direct exposure to the full rigors of the life that they would lead after initiation. Known evocatively as abstinentia, this typically involved 3 years of full-time attachment to a senior perfectus. Only at the end of the abstinentia, if they had conducted themselves satisfactorily, would they become eligible for the ritual known as the consolamentum, or consoling, that completed their own elevation to perfectus status. Though often referred to as the priests of the Cathar religion, several researchers have noted that the perfecti were in reality much closer in terms of their austerities, their personal comportment, and their function within the faith to the ascetic teachers of the East, the bonzes and fakirs of China and India, the adepts of the Orphic mysteries, or the teachers of Gnosticism. The impression is enhanced by contemporary reports which seem to describe perfecti in trance-like or meditative states. One eyewitness speaks of the extraordinary sight of a Cathar perfectus seated on a chair, motionless as a tree trunk, insensible to his surroundings. But the Cathar authorities knew very well that a life of meditation, total chastity, austerity, and withdrawal from the material world was not beyond the reach of the average mortal. Moreover, their society did not and could not consist solely of perfecti and candidate perfecti whose celibacy would provide them with no successors. What was needed was a much wider pool to draw on. This was supplied by a second grade or rank far more numerous than the perfecti, known as the credentes or believers. It was they, in their tens of thousands, who constituted the vast majority of all Cathars. It was they who contributed the social and economic energy, to say nothing of the military muscle, that made this religion such a threat to the Church of Rome. What the credentes believed in were the fundamental tenets of the dualistic faith concerning the existence of two gods, the evil nature of matter, and the imprisonment of the soul in flesh. They might even aspire ultimately to becoming wandering gurus or perfectus rank themselves, but the reality was that most credentes never took up the challenge. Instead, wherever Catharism was established, we know that its credente class lived ordinary lives of no great self-denial. They married, produced children, owned property, ate well, and generally enjoyed the world. They certainly attended the simple services and gatherings led by perfecti that were part of the Cathar calendar. Along with all other credentes, they likewise accepted and took with extreme seriousness a general duty to accommodate the impoverished perfecti on their travels and to provide them with a strong network and support system. They were also required to offer a ritual salute to any perfectus they might encounter. Called the melioramentum, this involved triple genuflections and greetings to the perfectus and culminated in the following exchange. The credente saying, "Pray God for me, a sinner, that he make me a good Christian and lead me to a good end." Perfectus replying, "May God be prayed that he may make you a good Christian." The exchange, explains medieval historian Malcolm Lambert, was standardized and had a special meaning. To be a good Christian, or a Christian at all, in Cathar belief, was to become a perfect. To come to a good end was to die in possession of the consolamentum, not having forfeited it by lapse. In the exchange and genuflection, perfect and adherent reminded each other of their own status, the one waiting, not yet freed from Satan, the other outside his power in a unique position. Credentes were taught that it was particularly important for them to find a perfectus and to perform the melioramentum if they had in any way been exposed to the contamination of Catholic influences. This was so at least partly because of obeisance amounting almost to worship and referred to in some contexts as adoration of the perfectus represented a direct and public denial of the Catholic Church. When the prominent credente, the Lady Fidas of Saint Michel, traveled to Rome with Countess Eleanor of Toulouse, she cheekily took a Cathar perfectus with her, quote, to worship him in the very chapel of the Pope. Whether they were nobles or peasants, however, the majority of credentes would postpone until their deathbeds the moment when they felt ready to summon a perfectus to confer upon them the dualistic baptism of the consolamentum. It was an act of momentous importance that filled the recipient with a charge of the Holy Spirit, and for some could open the door to the kingdom of heaven. Though it amounted on the surface to nothing more than a short ritual, accompanied by prayers and laying on of hands, the consolamentum was considered to be so powerful that it was sufficient by itself, even without years of itinerant austerity, to initiate the dying credenti into the ranks of the perfecti. He or she would thereafter consume only bread and water, avoiding any further contamination from the evil world of matter. The hope for those thus consoled and in a state of ritual purity might not have been that death would this time bring a final release from the cycle of rebirth in human form, but that it would, at the very least, bring progress on the chain of being towards it. On occasions when patients unexpectedly recovered after being consoled, they could always return to the normal life of a credente and to full involvement with the world. In that case, they would have to receive the consolamentum and enter a fast once again when death approached, or whatever progress their souls might have made in this incarnation would be lost. It was by no means certain that the next incarnation would bring the soul to a body that would again receive the Cathar teaching, or even necessarily to a human body at all, rather than, say, the body of a donkey, let alone the body of a Cathar. Credentes were therefore provided with a strong incentive to receive the consolamentum in this life, where they knew it was definitely available, but to so juggle things that they did not have to go through with it until their deathbed. During the late 12th century, when there were large numbers of perfecti on the roads and living in every village, town, and city of Occitania, this was not usually difficult to accomplish. But during the 13th century, as we shall see in chapters 6 and 7, Catharism became a persecuted faith throughout Europe, with the greatest attention paid to Occitania. There, amidst demonic scenes from the lowest circles of hell, the populations of entire cities were put to the sword by soldiers of the Church of Rome. The papal inquisitors followed, and as they went about their work, the numbers of perfecti fell into an ever more catastrophic decline with each new mass burning. By the early 14th century, there are only known to have been 3 perfecti still at work in the whole of the Languedoc, once the very epicenter of the faith. Surviving credentes faced great uncertainty as to whether they would be able to obtain the consolamentum at all. The desperate solution of many Cathars nearing the end of their natural lives in these last days was the endura, an Occitan word meaning fasting or hungering, applied to the bread and water fast that normally followed deathbed consolings. Now, however, those who had received the ritual preferred not to risk breaking their fast, even if they began to show signs of recovery. The consequence was that the endura, quote, came to have the precise and technical meaning of fasting to death after receiving the consolamentum. Abolishing superstition and the fear of hell. When extensive persecution of Catharism began in the 13th century, the fundamental difference in lifestyle between the consoled and the unconsoled, between perfecti and credentes, was sometimes seized on by the latter to try to persuade their accusers that they weren't heretics at all. In the Burg of Toulouse in 1223, for example, Jean Tisseret, a credenti in the prime of life who had no interest in an early consolamentum, was arrested and accused of heresy. "I have a wife and I sleep with her," he protested. "I have sons, I eat meat, I lie and swear." Along with marriage, sex and reproduction, and meat eating, lying and the swearing of oaths were forbidden to perfecti. Convicted on the evidence of witnesses, Tessier's arguments were ignored by the court. He was sentenced to burn at the stake and placed in the bishop's prison to await execution. The procedure now allowed him to recant and go free, but he stubbornly continued to profess his innocence and remained on death row. There he fell into conversation with several Cathar perfecti, and a few days later accepted the consolamentum at their hands, still refusing to recant beliefs that he now acknowledged he held. He was burnt with the rest. There are many reports of courage and extreme self-sacrifice from the era of persecution. They tell us that Catharism was capable of inspiring its adherents with profound and strongly held beliefs concerning the progress and afterlife destiny of the soul. Indeed, these beliefs were so strong that again and again, perfecti and credentes like Tessier were prepared to suffer death in the utmost agony rather than recant and jeopardize their imminent release from the evil world of matter. There are several well-attested accounts of the condemned rushing en masse towards the pyres that had been prepared for them and flinging themselves joyfully into the roaring flames. Whether we think of them as credulous fools, therefore, or as exalted martyrs, it seems that Catharism had liberated these people from the paralyzing fear of hell that the Catholic Church had used for centuries to terrify and close the minds of medieval Europeans. Indeed, such a liberation would have followed more or less automatically from conversion to Cathar dualism, which proposed no lower hell than the earth itself, the lowest plane of consciousness to which we sink, a place of trial and torment in which our souls were already undergoing fierce penances and had remained trapped for countless prior incarnations. Hell, in other words, was not an unknown destination to which we would be sent for sins defined by the Catholic Church, but a known one in which we are already present, but which it was our destiny one day to escape. In this way, at a stroke, the Cathars not only abolished all fear of death in their initiates, but also sundered bonds of superstition and demonology that had stalled the progress of Western civilization throughout the Dark Ages. Seeking to sweep the cobwebs away from all aspects of habitual religious behavior, they said that chanting in church deceived simple people and ridiculed as an irrational waste of money the Catholic practice of paying alms for souls in purgatory. By giving exposure and prominence to such ideas, albeit for just a brief period of history, the Cathars encouraged a new freedom of thought and a new spirit of flexibility and openness to change. The psychologist Arthur Geerdham believes that this was perhaps their most significant contribution to the emancipation of the common man. Not to understand this is to fail to realize that Catharism was not only an enlightened but an optimistic creed. Some of the contemporary defenders of Catharism regard it as a dour, Calvinistic, and basically pessimistic religion. Sir Stephen Runciman, who is, on the whole, very fair in his assessment of the Cathars, regards the religion as foredoomed because of its built-in pessimism. Those holding such views are at a loss to explain how such a repressive and pessimistic creed could have spread like wildfire through the most sophisticated and skeptical region of Europe. A renaissance ahead of its time. Catharism's sudden flowering took place at a time when Europe, stimulated by the contact with the East that the Crusaders had brought, was shaking off the slumber of the Dark Ages and rediscovering ancient wisdom in the classical texts. Often described by historians as the Renaissance of the 12th century, this period of change, experimentation, and broadened horizons ended hundreds of years of intellectual stagnation. It saw the birth of many new philosophical and scientific ideas, witnessed the rise of the first towering Gothic cathedrals, and experienced far-reaching social and economic changes. Together with the neighboring parts of eastern Spain and northern Italy, where the Cathar religion was also strong, the 12th century civilization of Occitania, urbanized, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, was indisputably ahead of anywhere else in Europe. It lay at the epicenter of what promised to become a great upheaval in Western values marked by a spirit of inquiry and the introduction of a gentler, more cosmopolitan, and more tolerant worldview. Moreover, had Catharism succeeded in all its aims, we can be certain that there would have been no place in this new age for the Catholic Church, which, as the Church of Satan, had for so long led so many souls astray. Far from succeeding, however, the Cathar heresy was crushed by a series of violent and genocidal crusades unleashed by the Catholic Church in the first half of the 13th century. The last of the resistance was then slowly and methodically finished off by the Papal Inquisition, which was successfully established in 1233, specifically for the repression and extirpation of Catharism. Had it not been for the destruction and dislocation wrought by these so-called Albigensian Crusades, some believe that the culture of the Languedoc could have anticipated the Renaissance in Italy by more than 2 centuries. Such speculations are frowned on by mainstream historians. As a result, Questions like, what would have happened to the West if Catharism had won its struggle against the Catholic Church, are rarely given any serious scholarly consideration. An exception was the French social philosopher and activist Simone Weil. She died in 1943 as a result of voluntary starvation in sympathy with her compatriots then under German occupation. Aged only 34 at the time of her fatal endura, Weil had spent the last few years of her life cultivating a deep interest in the unique culture of 12th century Occitania. She believed Catharism to have been the source of all its inspiration. By crushing the Greeks more than 2,000 years ago, she argued, the Roman Empire had brought sterility to the Mediterranean basin. Only once since then had another civilization raised its head in the same region, which might have had the capacity to attain a degree of freedom and spiritual creativity as high as that of ancient Greece. Snuffed out in the 13th century by the Church of Rome, this was the lost Occitanian civilization of the Cathars, which in Weil's analysis had somehow plugged itself into much older currents of thought. Little as we know about the Cathars, it seems clear that they were in some way the heirs of Platonic thought, of the esoteric teachings and mysteries of that pre-Roman civilization which embraced the Mediterranean and the Near East. Weil was one of those for whom Occitanian civilization in the 12th and 13th centuries had conceived the true Renaissance. Its potential had been greater even than that of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century. Because Languedoc was the heartland of this precocious civilization, the brutal engine of the Albigensian Crusades smashed not just the Cathars, but Europe's last living link with the ancient wisdom traditions of India, Persia, Egypt, and Greece. By contrast, the centuries that followed the destruction of Languedoc were an essay in totalitarian spirituality. Cosmopolitan cities. Occitanian society under the influence of the Cathars was anything but totalitarian. It was far ahead of the rest of Europe in the process of urbanization. Its rapidly expanding cities like Narbonne, Avignon, Toulouse, Montpellier, Béziers, and Carcassonne proudly guaranteed the freedom of thought and the economic and political independence of their citizens. Even in his own city, for example, the Count of Toulouse lacked any executive legal authority over the citizens and was only obeyed so long as he respected local common law. Narbonne, Avignon, Montpellier, and Béziers were hives of intellectual activity. In every sense, university cities, even before the universities had officially been founded. The most advanced course on Aristotle in Europe, which took account of the latest work by Arab scholars, was taught at Toulouse. Arab merchants and doctors had long found their way to Occitania across the Pyrenees from those parts of Spain then under Muslim control, or by sea from the east. They had been welcomed by the Cathars, who were inclined to see the Roman Catholic Church, not the infidel, as the natural enemy. Besides, for the Cathars, all human bodies, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jew, were the prisons of entrapped souls. Since all suffered the trials and rigors of the material world equally, and since only Catharism offered a way out of it, the oppression of one man by another on grounds of race or creed was absurd. Such ideas spilled over into civic life, and resident aliens in the cities of Occitania enjoyed full citizens' rights regardless of their nationality or creed. Moreover, while Catharism maintained its resolute antipathy to the Church of Rome, it was open-handed and liberal with other faiths that were willing to coexist peacefully with it. This was a time when possession of land by non-Christians was a criminal offense in northern France. It was a time when mobs of Catholics throughout Europe could frequently be worked up into frenzies of anti-Semitic prejudice. Yet in Occitania, large and long-established Jewish communities owned land, worshipped openly in synagogues, and prospered unmolested throughout the 12th century. They, too, seem to have been going through a period of creative, intellectual, and spiritual inquiry, just as the Cathar communities were. Indeed, it was in the coastal cities of Languedoc, in this same period, that Jewish savants elaborated the occult philosophy of the Kabbalah and began to explore its implications. A system of mysticism rooted in ancient Judaic traditions, Kabbalah laid claim to secret knowledge and divine revelation. It also exhibited strong dualistic tendencies in which the left side and the right side of the cosmos were envisaged in constant opposition and conflict. It is notable that acclaimed schools of Talmudic law flourished at Narbonne, Lunel, and Beaucaire in the 12th century, and that there is a report from 1160 of Jewish students from distant lands studying there. Intriguingly, the same source, Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela, also describes an encounter with a Jew at Lunel who had discarded all worldly business, studied day and night, kept fasts, and never ate meat. This suggests the possibility that Cathar ideas about how we should live in the world and what we are doing here had begun to have an impact not only on the large number of former Catholics it had freed from the fear of hell, but also on the followers of other faiths as well. Cathars and troubadours. It was in the 12th and 13th centuries that Catharism briefly lit up people's minds in Occitania. In the same period, another extraordinary intellectual phenomenon also appeared and disappeared in precisely the same region now encompassed by southern France, northern Spain, and northern Italy. This parallel phenomenon was the lyric poetry of the troubadours, a form that was invented in Occitania and composed in the Occitan language. Judged by literary experts today as one of the most brilliant schools that ever existed, it is accepted as an influence on all other later European lyrical poetry. Of much greater consequence, however, is the fact that troubadour poetry also had an unprecedented social impact. Indeed, it brought about what has been described as a, quote, revolution in thought and feeling, the effects of which are still apparent in Western culture. The revolution had to do with attitudes towards women in society. The troubadours themselves were favored at the many noble courts of Occitania, where they enjoyed high status and exceptional freedom of speech, sometimes even intervening in political matters. Launched from this position of eminence, their poetry focused self-respect-filled eyes upon women in general, including such lowly figures as shepherdesses, and upon the ladies of the courts in particular, bestowing an exalted, almost saintly status on the female gender. These poems promulgated the idea of courtly love, in which the male protagonist existed to worship his lady and to serve her faithfully. Such love was adulterous in the sense that the lady was almost always married, but also pure in the sense that it was not to be consummated physically. The essence of the whole exercise was self-denial and frustration, longing from afar, and the ennoblement of chastity. In the process, the man who must love and yet not touch, must desire and yet never be fulfilled, was raised above the common herd. What was really being celebrated, suggests Zoe Oldenburg, was nothing else, surely, but the urge to proclaim a triumph of self-will. Is it a coincidence that Cathar perfecti, too, sought to impose their will over every physical need and desire, and believed it necessary for their bodies to pass through suffering, protracted vigils, deprivation of the senses, and many deaths before that goal could be achieved? For these and other reasons, Oldenburg believes that there must have been a considerable degree of overlap between the troubadour movement and Catharism. She goes so far as to argue that on many occasions when, quote, the troubadours mention God and Jesus Christ, it is very probable that they are speaking as Cathars, and that their deity is the good God of the Manichaean faith. But Oldenburg is out of line. It is the consensus of medieval historians and literary scholars that the ideas diffused through Occitania by the troubadours in the 12th and 13th centuries had very little, and perhaps even nothing at all, to do with Catharism. We may only comment with Arthur Guierdham that this simply makes no sense. Quote, how could two such startling manifestations of culture occur at the same time and in a limited area without their being related to each other? To hold such an opinion is equivalent to saying that the teachings of Freud swept London in the 1920s but had no influence on medicine or literature. Women hold up half the sky. In tandem with the poetry of the troubadours, the basic organization and beliefs of Cathar religion also had the effect, whether by accident or by design, of elevating the status of women in Occitanian society. Catholicism had done nothing to dismantle the gross inequalities of the sexes that prevailed in the European Middle Ages and explicitly forbade women to become priests. Catharism, on the other hand, regarded the souls of men and women as absolutely equal. It saw no reason why the material envelopes that they were imprisoned in, namely their bodies, which by chance could be either male or female, should be treated with any less equality. For this reason, membership of the Cathar Perfectus class was not restricted by sex, and both men and women could and did become perfecti. On the highways and byways of these dangerous times, Cathar Perfecti preached and traveled less than their male counterparts for understandable reasons of physical security. Nor do we find any women among the relatively few bishops and deacons at the top of the simple, low-maintenance, and minimally hierarchical structure by which Catharism was administered in Occitania. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that women were highly esteemed and enjoyed great influence in their communities, where they often established group homes for the daughters, widows, dowagers of the local petty nobility and artisan classes. In practice, it is thought that the cadre of active perfecti present in Occitania at any one time is likely to have included rather more males than females, perhaps on the order of 6 to 4. But this resulted from individual choices, not policy, and was compensated by a higher ratio of women among the credentes. In summary, by contrast with anything the Catholic Church had to offer, the status of women within the Cathar faith was high, and their role both important and recognized. This liberation, too, must have played its part in the great awakening of ideas and human potential that took place in Occitania in the 12th century. The Revolution and the New World Order. The point we wish to make here is that although Catharism was a system of inspired spiritual knowledge, and in every sense a religion, it was also a great deal more than that. We've seen that it was, at one level, a social program anticipating by centuries the modern recognition that human potential can never be fully realized without women's liberation. Likewise, we've seen how the Cathar doctrine of the equal predicament of souls and the basic irrelevance of the sex, race, or creed of the bodies in which they happen to be trapped lent itself naturally to the refreshing liberalism, open-mindedness, cosmopolitanism, and democratizing tendencies of Occitanian society. Catharism was also a comprehensive philosophy of anti-materialism that offered all who adhered to it a choice of two very clear ways forward in this life: a high road and a low road. The high road was the way of solitary meditation and renunciation of the world, the suppression through willpower of all physical needs, attachments, and desires. That was followed by the perfecti. The low road was the way of engagement in the world, followed by ordinary credentes until they received the consolamentum on their deathbeds. They hoped to make solid progress in this incarnation in the great project of freeing their souls from the trap of matter, but understood that they might need to return again and again to the material plane before that objective would finally be achieved. Had it been allowed to become widespread and to win dominance over the Catholic Church throughout Europe, we cannot say what the long-term political and economic consequences of such a philosophy might have been. Simple logic suggests that it would have been most unlikely to have led to either of the two great political and economic systems, capitalism and communism, that were ultimately to dominate human affairs in the 19th and 20th centuries. Both are entirely materialistic in their outlook, and their disagreement is only over the manner in which the riches of the world are to be extracted and divided up. we can suppose that the very different concerns of Catharism and its horror of material entrapment would have led, during the course of history, to very different arrangements concerning production, the ownership of its means, and the uses and exploitation of the masses. Already in the 12th century Occitania, there is evidence that the Cathars had begun to meddle with the feudal economic order through programs of adult education and practical training for the poor and disenfranchised. For example, workshops run by skilled perfecti were set up to provide apprenticeships in leather, paper making, and the textile trade. One of the objectives of these workshops was undoubtedly to turn out missionaries who could be self-sufficient as they wandered from town to town, making conversions. As we noted earlier, surviving records show a particularly strong concentration in Cathar areas of weavers and other workers in the textile trade. But the long-term effects of such an education program, leading as it did to the foundation of an instructed artisan class, might have been literally revolutionary if it had been allowed to continue. Little wonder, therefore, that the French philosopher Voltaire seized on the memory of the suppression of Catharism to rabble-rouse against the evils of the church and of feudal oppression of the masses. Initiated as a Freemason in 1778, as we saw in Chapter 1, Voltaire's ideas were amongst the cocktail of influences that precipitated the French Revolution in 1789. Pacifism was another central value in the ethical system of the perfecti, and a resolute commitment to nonviolence was part of the regime of self-control over the baser bodily instincts and desires that their initiation required of them. There are cases on record of perfecti who chose to be burned at the stake rather than satisfy the Inquisition that they were innocent of heresy by killing even as lowly a creature as a hen. Yet surprisingly, for people with such apparent contempt for their own lives and for the pains of death, it has been observed that the perfecti, quote, retained an absolute respect for the fact of life itself. They would not allow any violent intervention by the human will, which they regarded as invariably evil and arbitrary, in the fate of a soul pursuing its road to salvation. The same reasoning explains why the perfecti were utterly opposed to the use of the death penalty, even for capital offenses. They also claimed that common criminals should not be punished, but instead be educated to become better citizens. Such avant-garde doctrines were of course denounced by the church as scandalous. Equally controversial was the strident insistence of the Cathars, quite contrary to the spirit of the times and the teachings of Catholicism, that the preachers of crusade were murderers. Had the Cathars continued to win converts at the rate they achieved in Occitania, instead of themselves being stamped out significantly by a crusade, what might the consequences have been? Isn't there every likelihood that they would have transformed the international landscape of the Middle Ages, again with incalculable but quite possibly very positive consequences for the subsequent course of world history, fighting back. But the world is the way it has been, not the way it might have been, and the Cathars did not win. As we will see in chapters 6 and 7, they lost everything: their lands, their culture, their freedom, and their lives. In the blood-drenched horror of the Albigensian Crusades ravaging Occitania between 1209 and 1244, these were 35 years of virtually unremitting war, a brutal war of sieges and burnings and fearful massacres. Despite belonging to the Church of Love, therefore, which did violence to no man, the very fact that a nation of vegetarian pacifists were able to resist the papal armies for so long tells us that they did not simply lie down and surrender when they were attacked. They fought back, tooth and nail. This is by no means the only such paradox that Catharism offers. We've noted already that its doctrinal horror of sex as the production line that delivers new material incarnations for trapped souls to be reborn in did not result in a concomitant change in reproductive behavior in Occitania during the Cathar heyday. On the contrary, Cathar families went on producing children in large numbers, and the region enjoyed rapid population growth. The solution to the apparent paradox lies in the very different standards of behavior expected of credentes and perfecti. The former adhere to the beliefs of Catharism, but were not required to emulate the practices of its adepts. We've seen how the system left credentes free to marry, make babies, and eat meat as they chose. By the same token, despite its pacifism, it also left them free to resist persecution and to defend their country and their faith with force of arms, even if doing so required them to commit acts of, quote, violent intervention in the fate of other souls, unquote. The perfecti themselves seem always to have stood back from the fray, leaving the actual job of fighting the enemy to the credentes. Still, there is evidence in the face of pitiless Catholic aggression and mounting atrocities against Cathars that even the perfecti found reason to qualify their philosophy of absolute pacifism and nonviolence. Since this world was the creation of the evil one, the evil God, and the material realm was fully in his power, it followed that he could create beings of pure evil, demons who merely looked like humans but had no souls, to destroy the good men and good women of the Cathar faith. To fight against such beings, who were numerous in their crusading armies and amongst the inquisitors, was hardly a crime. The ancient enemy. So in defending themselves against the murderous assault of the Albigensian Crusades, Cathars came to feel vindicated in their beliefs. The Catholic Church was the instrument of an evil God who had created the material world as his personal fiefdom of suffering and horror, pain and misery. Now, day by day in Occitania, there was ever more compelling evidence for the accuracy of this proposition. The massacres repeatedly unleashed upon the civilian population, the tortures and the informer culture devised by the Inquisition, and the endless holocaust of the Cathar faithful. The scale, ferocity, and sheer thoroughness of the Crusades are, of course, a measure of the threat that the Church perceived in Catharism. We already knew that the military support given to the Cathars by the great lords of Occitania had triggered this perception of danger. But as we looked through the heresiological literature of the period, we could not fail to note that something else, perhaps almost equally potent, seemed to have been at work as well. For although the scale of the Church's response was new, indeed unprecedented, the Catholic authorities clearly recognized Catharism as an old and deadly enemy. It was for this reason that they so often referred to the Cathars as Manichees, or Manichees, a heresy over which Rome had supposedly triumphed centuries earlier. For their part, though they would never have identified themselves as Manichees, the Cathars claimed that their religion had come down to them from antiquity, passed from good man to good man. It was, they said, the true faith that the Church had usurped in the early days of Christianity. Most medieval scholars today prefer to argue that Catharism was essentially a new phenomenon and very much the product of its times. But neither of the protagonists in this affair, Catholics or Cathars, thought this was the case. They believed themselves to be caught up in the latest episode of an ancient struggle of profound consequence for the future of humankind. In the next chapters, with due respect to the opinions of the experts, we will investigate the possibility that the protagonists could have been right. So, my friends, I think we're going to leave off here for today before we jump into chapter 3 for our next video. So once again, just want to thank you. My name is David Bryson. Tune into my YouTube channel for other interesting information that we share there, and we will see you next time for part 2 of this series on the Cathars.